Stoicism is an ancient Greek and then Roman philosophy of the Hellenistic and Roman imperial periods. The Stoics believed that the universe operated according to reason, or logos, providing a unified account of the world, constructed from ideals of rational discourse, monistic physics, and naturalistic ethics. These three ideals constitute virtue, which is necessary for the Stoic goal of living a well-reasoned life. Stoic logic focuses on highly intentional reasoning through propositions, arguments, and the differentiation between truth and falsehood. Philosophical discourse is paramount in Stoicism, including the view that the mind is in rational dialogue with itself. Stoic ethics centers on virtue as the highest good, cultivating emotional self-control, a calm problem-solving state of mind, and rational judgment to attain lifelong flourishing, eudaimonia. At the same time, passions, anxieties, and insecurities are viewed as misguided reactions that ought to be controlled through self-disciplined practice. Of all the schools of ancient Western philosophy, Stoicism made the greatest claim to being utterly systematic. Stoicism was founded in the ancient Agora of Athens by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, and flourished throughout the Greco-Roman world until the 3rd century CE. Stoicism emerged from the Cynic tradition and was popularized through public teaching at the Stoa Poikile, a painted colonnade. Among its adherents was Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Along with Aristotelian term logic, the system of propositional logic developed by the Stoics was one of the two great systems of logic in the classical world. It was largely built and shaped by Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school in the 3rd century BCE. Chrysippus's logic differed from term logic because it was based on the analysis of propositions rather than terms. Stoicism experienced a decline after Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century CE, although Gnosticism lingered and incorporated pure elements of Stoicism and Platonism. Since then, it has seen revivals, notably in the Renaissance, Neo-Stoicism, and in the contemporary era. Its influence extended to Roman thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus and later influenced Christianity and the Renaissance Neo-Stoicism movement. Stoicism shaped subsequent developments in logic and inspired modern cognitive therapies. The name Stoicism derives from the Stoa Poikile, ancient Greek, pi omicron iota kappa lambda eta sigma tau omicron, or painted porch. A colonnade decorated with mythic and historical battle scenes on the north side of the Agora in Athens where Zeno of Citium and his followers gathered to discuss their ideas, near the end of the 4th century BCE. Unlike the Epicureans, Zeno chose to teach his philosophy in a public space. Stoicism was originally known as Zenonism. However, this name was soon dropped, probably because the Stoics did not consider their founders to be perfectly wise and to avoid the risk of the philosophy becoming a cult of personality. Zeno's ideas developed from those of the Cynics, brought to him by Crates of Thebes, whose founding father, Antisthenes, had been a disciple of Socrates. Zeno's most influential successor was Chrysippus, who followed Cleanthes as leader of the school, and was responsible for molding what is now called Stoicism. Stoicism became the foremost popular philosophy among the educated elite in the Hellenistic world and the Roman Empire to the point where, in the words of Gilbert Murray, nearly all the successors of Alexander professed themselves Stoics. Later Roman Stoics focused on promoting a life in harmony within the universe, within which we are active participants. Scholars usually divide the history of Stoicism into three phases: the early Stoa, from Zeno's founding to Antipater; the middle Stoa, including Panetius and Posidonius; and the late Stoa, including Musonius Rufus, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. No complete works survived from the first two phases of Stoicism. Only Roman texts from the late Stoa survived. Chrysippus, the third leader of the Stoic school, wrote more than 300 books on logic. His works were lost, but an outline of his logical system may be reconstructed from fragments and testimony. For the Stoics, logic, logik, was the part of philosophy which examined reason, logos. To achieve a happy life, a life worth living, requires logical thought. The Stoics held that an understanding of ethics was impossible without logic. In the words of Inwood, the Stoics believed that logic helps a person see what is the case, reason effectively about practical affairs, stand his or her ground amid confusion, differentiate the certain from the probable, and so forth. To the Stoics, logic was a wide field of knowledge which included the study of language, grammar, rhetoric and epistemology. However, all of these fields were interrelated, and the Stoics developed their logic, or dialectic, within the context of their theory of language and epistemology. The Stoic tradition of logic originated in the 4th century BCE in a different school of philosophy known as the Megarian school. It was two dialecticians of this school, Diodorus Cronus and his pupil Philo, who developed their own theories of modalities and of conditional propositions. The founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, studied under the Megarians, and he was said to have been a fellow pupil with Philo. However, the outstanding figure in the development of Stoic logic was Chrysippus of Soli, c. 279, c. 206 BCE, the third head of the Stoic school. Chrysippus shaped much of Stoic logic as we know it, creating a system of propositional logic. The logical writings by Chrysippus are, however, almost entirely lost. Instead, his system has to be reconstructed from the partial and incomplete accounts preserved in the works of later authors. The smallest unit in Stoic logic is an assertable, axiomata, a proposition which is either true or false and which either affirms or denies. Examples of assertables include it is night, it is raining this afternoon, and no one is walking. Assertables have a truth value such that they are only true or false depending on when it was expressed, e.g. the assertable it is night will only be true if it is true that it is night. The Stoics catalogued these simple assertables according to whether they are affirmative or negative, and whether they are definite or indefinite, or both. Compound assertables can be built up from simple ones through the use of logical connectives, which examine choice and consequence such as if, then, either, or, and not both. Chrysippus seems to have been responsible for introducing the three main types of connectives, the conditional, if, conjunctive, and disjunctive, or. A typical conditional takes the form of if P then Q, whereas a conjunction takes the form of both P and Q, and a disjunction takes the form of either P or Q. The or they used is exclusive, unlike the inclusive or generally used in modern formal logic. These connectives are combined with the use of not for negation. Thus the conditional can take the following four forms: 1. If P, then Q2, if not P, then Q3, if P, then not Q4, if not P, then not Q. Later Stoics added more connectives. The pseudo-conditional took the form of since P then Q, and the causal assertable took the form of because P then Q. There was also a comparative, or dissertive more/less, likely, P then Q. Assertables can also be distinguished by their modal properties, whether they are possible, impossible, necessary, or non-necessary. In this, the Stoics were building on an earlier Megarian debate initiated by Diodorus Cronus. Diodorus had defined possibility in a way which seemed to adopt a form of fatalism. Diodorus defined possible as that which either is or will be true. Thus, there are no forever unrealized possibilities. Whatever is possible is or one day will be true. His pupil Philo, rejecting this, defined possible as that which is capable of being true by the proposition's own nature. Thus a statement like this piece of wood can burn is possible, even if it spent its entire existence on the bottom of the ocean. Chrysippus, on the other hand, was a causal determinist. He thought that true causes inevitably give rise to their effects and that all things arise in this way. But he was not a logical determinist or fatalist. He wanted to distinguish between possible and necessary truths. Thus, he took a middle position between Diodorus and Philo, combining elements of both their modal systems. Chrysippus's set of Stoic modal definitions was as follows. In Stoic logic, an argument is defined as a compound or system of premises and a conclusion. A typical Stoic syllogism is, if it is day, it is light, it is day, therefore it is light. It has a non-simple assertable for the first premise, if it is day, it is light, and a simple assertable for the second premise, it is day. Stoic logic also uses variables that stand for propositions to generalize arguments of the same form. In more general terms, this argument would be, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. There can be many variations of these 5 indemonstrable arguments. For example, the assertables in the premises can be more complex, and the following syllogism is a valid example of the second indemonstrable, modus tollens. If both P and Q, then are, not are, therefore not, both P and Q. Similarly, one can incorporate negation into these arguments. A valid example of the fourth indemonstrable, strong modus tollendo ponens or exclusive disjunctive syllogism, is either, not P, or Q, not P, therefore Q, which, incorporating the principle of double negation, is equivalent to either, not P. However, many other arguments are not expressed in the form of the 5 indemonstrables, and the task is to show how they can be reduced to one of the 5 types. A simple example of Stoic reduction is reported by Sextus Empiricus, if both P and Q, then are, not are, but also P. Therefore not Q. This can be reduced to 2 separate indemonstrable arguments of the second and third type, if both P and Q, then are, not are, therefore not, both P and Q, not, both P and Q, P, therefore not Q. The Stoics stated that complex syllogisms could be reduced to the indemonstrables through the use of 4 ground rules or the mata. Of these 4, the mata, only 2 have survived. 1. The so-called first thema was a rule of antilogism, when from 2 assertables, a third follows. Then from either of them together with the contradictory of the conclusion the contradictory of the other follows. The other, the third thema, was a cut rule by which chain syllogisms could be reduced to simple syllogisms. The importance of these rules is not altogether clear. In the 2nd century BCE, Antipater of Tarsus is said to have introduced a simpler method involving the use of fewer themata, although few details survive concerning this. In addition to describing which inferences are valid ones, part of a Stoic's logical training was the enumeration and refutation of false arguments, including the identification of paradoxes, which represented a challenge to the basic logical notions of the Stoics, such as truth or falsehood. One paradox studied by Chrysippus, known as the liar paradox, asked: a man says he is lying, is what he says true or false? If the man says something true, then it seems he is lying, but if he is lying, then he is not saying something true, and so on. Another, known as the Sorites paradox or heap, asked: how many grains of wheat do you need before you get a heap? It was said to challenge the idea of true or false by offering up the possibility of vagueness. In mastering these paradoxes, the Stoics hoped to cultivate their rational powers, to more easily enable ethical reflection, permit secure and confident arguing, and lead themselves to truth. The Stoics held that all beings, nu tau alpha, although not all things, tau iota nu, are material. Besides the existing beings, they admitted four incorporeals, asomata time, place, void, and sayable. They were held to be just subsisting, while such a status was denied to universals. Thus, they accepted Anaxagoras' idea, as did Aristotle, that if an object is hot, it is because some part of a universal heat body had entered the object. But, unlike Aristotle, they extended the idea to cover all chance incidents. Thus, if an object is red, it would be because some part of a universal red body had entered the object. They held that there were four categories. 1. Substance, pi omicron kappa epsilon nu omicron nu, the primary matter, formless substance, ousia, that things are made of. 2. Quality, pi omicron iota nu, the way matter is organized to form an individual object. In Stoic physics, a physical ingredient, pneuma, air or breath, which informs the matter. 3. Somehow disposed, pi omega chi omicron nu, particular characteristics, not present within the object, such as size, shape, action, and posture. 4. Somehow disposed in relation to something, characteristics related to other phenomena, such as the position of an object within time and space relative to other objects. A simple example of the Stoic categories in use is provided by Jacques Brunschwig. I am a certain lump of matter, and thereby a substance, an existent something, and thus far that is all. I am a man, and this individual man that I am, and thereby qualified by a common quality and a peculiar one. I am sitting or standing, disposed in a certain way. I am the father of my children, the fellow citizen of my fellow citizens, disposed in a certain way in relation to something else. 61. According to the Stoics, knowledge can be attained through the application of reason to the impressions, phantasiae, received by the mind through the senses. The mind can judge, sigma upsilon gamma kappa alpha tau theta epsilon sigma iota, synchetathesis, approve or reject, an impression, enabling it to distinguish a true representation of reality from one that is false. Some impressions can be assented to immediately, but others can achieve only varying degrees of hesitant approval, which can be labeled belief or opinion, doxa. It is only through reason that we gain clear comprehension and conviction, catalepsis. Certainty and true knowledge, episteme, achievable by the Stoic sage, can be attained only by verifying the conviction with the expertise of one's peers and the collective judgment of humankind. According to the Stoics, the universe is a material reasoning substance, logos, which was divided into two classes, the active and the passive. The passive substance is matter itself, while the active substance is an intelligent ether or primordial fire, which acts on the passive matter. The logos or anima mundi pervading and animating the entire universe. It was conceived as material and is usually identified with God or nature. The Stoics also referred to the seminal reason, logos spermatikos, or the law of generation in the universe, which was the principle of the active reason working in inanimate matter. Humans, too, each possess a portion of the divine logos, which is the primordial fire and reason that controls and sustains the universe. Everything is subject to the laws of fate, for the universe acts according to its own nature, and the nature of the passive matter it governs. Stoicism does not posit a beginning or end to the universe. The current universe is a phase in the present cycle, preceded by an infinite number of universes, doomed to be destroyed, ekpyrosis, conflagration, and recreated again, and to be followed by another infinite number of universes. Alongside Aristotle's ethics, the Stoic tradition forms one of the major founding approaches to virtue ethics. The Stoics believe that the practice of virtue is enough to achieve eudaimonia, a well-lived life. The Stoics identified the path to achieving it with a life spent practicing the four cardinal virtues in everyday life: prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, as well as living in accordance with nature. The Stoics are especially known for teaching that virtue is the only good for human beings, and that external things, such as health, wealth, and pleasure, are not good or bad in themselves, adiaphora, but have value as material for virtue to act upon. Many Stoics, such as Seneca and Epictetus, emphasize that because virtue is sufficient for happiness, a sage would be emotionally resilient to misfortune. The Stoics also believed that certain destructive emotions resulted from errors of judgment, and people should aim to maintain a will, called prohairesis, that is in accordance with nature. Because of this, the Stoics thought the best indication of an individual's philosophy was not what a person said but how the person behaved. The Stoics outlined that our own actions, thoughts, and reactions are within our control. These suggest a space that is up to us or within our power. Stoic ethics involves improving the individual's ethical and moral well-being. Virtue consists in a will that is in agreement with nature. The foundation of Stoic ethics is that good lies in the state of the soul itself, in wisdom and self-control. For the Stoics, reason meant using logic and understanding the processes of nature, the logos or universal reason, inherent in all things, as a means of overcoming destructive emotions. This principle also applies to the realm of interpersonal relationships, to be free from anger, envy, and jealousy, and even to accept slaves as equals of others because all are products of nature. The Stoic ethic espouses a deterministic perspective. In regard to those who lack Stoic virtue, Cleanthes once opined that the wicked person is like a dog tied to a cart, and compelled to go wherever it goes. A Stoic of virtue, by contrast, would amend one's will to suit the world and remain, in the words of Epictetus, sick and yet happy, in peril and yet happy, dying and yet happy, in exile and happy, in disgrace and happy, thus positing a completely autonomous individual will, and at the same time a universe that is a rigidly deterministic single whole. For the Stoic Chrysippus, the passions are evaluative judgments. A passion is a disturbing and misleading force in the mind which occurs because of a failure to reason correctly. The Stoics used the word to discuss many common emotions such as anger, fear, and excessive joy. Incorrect judgment as to a present good gives rise to delight, while lust is a wrong estimate about the future. Unreal imaginings of evil cause distress about the present, or fear for the future. The ideal Stoic would instead measure things at their real value, and see that the passions are not natural. To be free of the passions is to have a happiness which is self-contained. There would be nothing to fear, for unreason is the only evil, no cause for anger, for others cannot harm you. 74. The Stoics arranged the passions under four headings: distress, pleasure, fear, and lust. One report of the Stoic definitions of these passions appears in the treatise on passions by Chrysippus, trans. Long Sedley, page 411, modified. Two of these passions, distress and delight, refer to emotions currently present, and two of these, fear and lust, refer to emotions directed at the future. Thus there are just two states directed at the prospect of good and evil, but subdivided as to whether they are present or future. Numerous subdivisions of the same class were brought under the head of the separate passions. The wise person, Sophos, is someone who is free from the passions, apatheia or impassivity. Instead, the sage experiences good feelings, eupatheia, which are clear-headed. These emotional impulses are not excessive, but nor are they diminished emotions. Instead, they are the correct rational emotions. The Stoics listed the good feelings under the headings of joy, chara, wish, bolasis, and caution, eulabia. Thus, if something is present which is a genuine good, then the wise person experiences an uplift in the soul, joy, chara. The Stoics also subdivided the good feelings. The Stoics considered suicide permissible for the wise person in circumstances that might prevent them from living a virtuous life, such as if they fell victim to severe pain or disease, but otherwise, suicide would usually be seen as a rejection of one's social duty. For example, Plutarch reports that accepting life under tyranny would have compromised Cato's self-consistency, Constantia, as a Stoic and impaired his freedom to make the honorable moral choices. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Roman emperor. For around 500 years, Stoic logic was one of the two great systems of logic. The logic of Chrysippus was discussed alongside that of Aristotle, and it may well have been more prominent since Stoicism was the dominant philosophical school. 90. From a modern perspective, Aristotle's term logic and, in late antiquity, the Stoic school fell into decline, and the last pagan philosophical school, the Neoplatonists, adopted Aristotle's logic for their own. Plotinus had criticized both Aristotle's categories and those of the Stoics. His student Porphyry, however, defended Aristotle's scheme. He justified this by arguing that they should be interpreted strictly as expressions, rather than as metaphysical realities. The approach can be justified, at least in part, by Aristotle's own words in the categories. Boethius' acceptance of Porphyry's interpretation led to their being accepted by scholastic philosophy. As a result, the Stoic writings on logic did not survive, and only elements of Stoic logic made their way into the logical writings Boethius and other later commentators, transmitting confused parts of Stoic logic to the Middle Ages. Propositional logic was redeveloped by Peter Abelard in the 12th century, but by the mid-15th century the only logic which was being studied was a simplified version of Aristotle's. Knowledge about Stoic logic as a system was lost until the 20th century, when logicians familiar with the modern propositional calculus reappraised the ancient accounts of it. The Fathers of the Church regarded Stoicism as a pagan philosophy. Nonetheless, early Christian writers used some of the central philosophical concepts of Stoicism. Examples include the terms logos, virtue, spirit, and conscience. Like Stoicism, Christianity asserts an inner freedom in the face of the external world, a belief in human kinship with nature or God, a sense of the innate depravity, or persistent evil, of humankind, and the futility and temporary nature of worldly possessions and attachments. Both encourage equanimity with respect to the passions and inferior emotions, such as lust and envy, so that the higher possibilities of one's humanity can be awakened and developed. Stoic influence can also be seen in the works of Ambrose of Milan, Marcus Minucius Felix, and Tertullian. Neo-Stoicism was a philosophical movement that arose in the late 16th century from the works of the Renaissance humanist Justus Lipsius, who sought to combine the beliefs of Stoicism and Christianity. The project of Neo-Stoicism has been described as an attempt by Lipsius to construct a secular ethics based on Roman Stoic philosophy. He did not endorse religious toleration in an unqualified way, hence the importance of a morality not tied to religion. The work of Guillaume du Ver, Traité de la Constance, 1594, was another important influence in the Neo-Stoic movement. Where Lipsius had mainly based his work on the writings of Seneca, du Ver emphasized Epictetus. Pierre Charon came to a neo-Stoic position through the impact of the French wars of religion. He made a complete separation of morality and religion. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant declared that since Aristotle, logic has not been able to advance a single step, and is thus to all appearance a closed and complete body of doctrine. To 19th-century historians, who believed that Hellenistic philosophy represented a decline from that of Plato and Aristotle, Stoic logic was seen with contempt. Karl Prantl thought that Stoic logic was dullness, triviality, and scholastic quibbling, and he welcomed the fact that the works of Chrysippus were no longer extant. Although developments in modern logic that parallel Stoic logic began in the middle of the 19th century with the work of George Boole and Augustus de Morgan, Stoic logic itself was only reappraised in the 20th century, beginning with the work of Polish logician Jan Łukasiewicz and Benson Mates. According to Suzanne Bobzian, the many close similarities between Chrysippus' philosophical logic and that of Gottlob Frege are especially striking. What we see as a result is a close similarity between these methods of reasoning and the behavior of digital computers. The code happens to come from the 19th century logician and mathematician George Boole, whose aim was to codify the relations studied much earlier by Chrysippus, albeit with greater abstraction and sophistication. Later generations built on Boole's insights, but the logic that made it all possible was the interconnected logic of an interconnected universe, discovered by the ancient Chrysippus, who labored long ago under an old Athenian Stoa. Contemporary usage defines a Stoic as a person who represses feelings or endures patiently. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Stoicism notes, "The sense of the English adjective, stoical, is not utterly misleading with regard to its philosophical origins." Contemporary Stoicism draws from the late 20th and early 21st century spike in publications of scholarly works on ancient Stoicism. The revival of Stoicism in the 20th century can be traced to the publication of Problems in Stoicism by A. Long in 1971. According to philosopher Pierre Hadot, philosophy for a Stoic is not just a set of beliefs or ethical claims. It is a way of life involving constant practice and training, or ascesis, an active process of constant practice and self-reminder. Epictetus, in his discourses, distinguished between three types of act: judgment, desire, and inclination, which Hadot identifies these three acts with logic, physics, and ethics, respectively. Hadot writes that in the Meditations, each maxim develops either one of these very characteristic topoi, i.e., acts, or two of them or three of them. Stoic philosophy was the original philosophical inspiration for modern cognitive psychotherapy, particularly as mediated by Albert Ellis' rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, the major precursor of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The original cognitive therapy treatment manual for depression by Aaron T. Beck et al. States, "The philosophical origins of cognitive therapy can be traced back to the Stoic philosophers." A well-known quotation from Enchiridion of Epictetus was taught to most clients during the initial session of traditional REBT by Ellis and his followers. "It's not the events that upset us, but our judgments about the events."